You're live, Alex. We'll give it a few seconds for the attendees to come in.
All right, welcome everyone. We may still have a few more people joining us in the next few seconds and minutes, but I think it's best to get started as we do only have an hour for this event. Welcome, my name is Alex Benkenstein. I head the Climate and Natural Resources Program at a African-based think tank. We're called the South African Institute of International Affairs. We are based in South Africa, but we work on issues certainly of regional relevance, and also link in then bringing African perspectives into global processes across a range of issues, economic diplomacy, more traditional foreign policy concerns, and of course in the climate and natural resources area. Sorry, Yusuf, could you just mute yourself? There we go. So we work across a range of areas. To those of you who are not familiar with our institute, I really do encourage you to engage us. The easiest way to do that is through the website, and you'll see that there's a range of research, policy relevant research and material that is available there for free download. There's no paywall. So to get to the topic of today's event, I think a very important event, or a very important topic, but also something that's critical that we approach with a necessary nuance. We know that this nexus, this connection between climate change on one hand and conflict on the others, is an area that's increasingly on the political agenda. It's the sort of thing that is coming up in national and regional risks assessments from departments of defense and other security agencies. And then, of course, towards the end of last year, there was the motion to actually adopt a UN Security Council resolution on climate and conflict. That ultimately wasn't passed, but shortly thereafter, the African Union Peace and Security Council issued a communique on climate and conflict, where they spoke about climate change as a threat multiplier to peace and security across the landscape, or to the security landscape of the continent, with the potential to aggravate existing vulnerabilities, tensions, and conflicts. And we're seeing those direct impacts and the potential for severe social and even political dislocation of climate change events or environmental events. Mozambique, which is going to be a focus of our discussion today, through Cyclone Idai in 2019. South Africa, recently we had horrific death toll of I think we're over 400 dead from the floods in the Durban area. So yes, these are issues that I think urgently need discussion, and that we need to think. It's also a topic that can lean towards a kind of sensationalist interpretation, and that's something we need to guard against, because that could then lead to policy prescriptions or policy responses and advices that is actually not suited to the real problem as it exists before us. So we frame today's discussion as climate conflict nexus, Cabo, Delgado, and beyond. And I think that and beyond, I just want to pause there for a second, because all our speakers are not experts on the conflict in Cabo Delgado. What we want to do is we want to use that as a jumping off point, a point to make our discussion maybe somewhat concrete when we discuss these issues, which can sometimes be a little bit conceptual. So we're going to have two speakers from Mozambique, Yusuf Adam will kick us off, speaking about Cabo Delgado. I've also asked, you see on the notice, Yanani Vivekananda, she's not able to make it. I've asked Cecilia Macamo, also based in Mozambique, who's done more work in a different area of Mozambique, in Beira, an area that's also been heavily exposed to climate impacts, to speak a little bit to that context. And I think perhaps allow us to have a bit of a contrast in these two regions. We'll then hand over to Jürgen Schäffern, who's based at the University of Hamburg, and finally Julia Friedberg, also from the University of Hamburg, but currently PhD at UCT, if I understand correctly.
Also at Hamburg, I'm a PhD student. Jürgen is actually my supervisor.
Oh, okay. Thanks for clarifying. Sorry, I've made that mistake before. All right. So I've already probably taken too much time. I've asked our speakers to take about 5 minutes, certainly no longer than 10 minutes, to make some introductory remarks so that we can then get into the Q&A. For our audience, you would be able to raise questions, preferably in the Q&A function, which you should see at the bottom of your screen. If you have any trouble with that, you can use the chat function. All right, Yusuf, would you take us away? You're muted at the moment. Yusuf, you're muted.
Yeah.
There we go.
Yes, thank you. Sorry. Good morning to everyone. I am a historian, but I also do work with issues linked to environment, natural resources, populations, etc. I'm just going to be just a short introduction to say that when we think about the relationships between natural resources, use, policies, etc., and insurgencies, we have to see it as a two-way street, that there are the use of natural resources, policies, etc., can influence the emergence of insurgency, but the insurgency can also impact on the use of natural resources, etc. And in Cabo Delgado, we have examples of this two-way street. As you know, it's a very complex situation in Cabo Delgado, where in the 60s and 70s, in this place around Nangad, which is always in the news, there was a huge area, concession area, owned by a South African company called, the concession has been called Comadel. And it is very important to look at this concession because that was one of the remaining, I don't know how do you call it in English, but in Portuguese we call it pau-ferro, and I don't have here, I can say that the scientific name is Schwarzia madagascariensis. There was a forest of, today there is no forest. We have been reduced to what happens everywhere in Africa. You find one tree here, after 3-4 kilometers you find another tree, and if someone sees it, they behave like the Spaniards. If you see something growing, just cut it off. If you see some animal in the middle of the forest, please shoot it. You know, it's a joke, and the Spanish hunters and conservationists and even who are operators of forests are much more serious than that. But that is a common, you know, joke, which is told by a lot of my friends, even Spaniards. So we just leave it there. And then you have serious problems in the forests areas, concessions, etc., which have to do with the involvement of the populations. The populations, the law guarantees that the population which lives in these areas, they have to have access to 20% of the taxes paid by the operators to the government. That is more easily said than done, and it doesn't that doesn't work that way. It doesn't arrive to the residents of the village, but it stays in the hand of the more important people in the village or in a group of villages. And you say, why your natural resources committee is not working? Oh, we don't have ideas, we don't have means to go to town, etc., which is always a way of taking advantage. And when you look at these committees, they should be democratically elected. But if you work with them, you discover that the president is the head of the village and is the ex-traditional chief. His wife is the head of the women's group. His son takes care of some other role in this committee. And my work and my colleagues from Zurich University and Eduard Mondlane University, we worked for some 10 years around in these areas, trying to organize these committees, helping them to produce their own plans, discuss with them their plans, and also working together with the private owners of the concessions. We worked with Mr. Mohamed Farouk Jamal, who was the owner of a company called MITI, and it was, you know, again, it's always a two-way street, and we worked together for many years. Then the war came, and we are no longer there. Then we have also to take into account what has been going on the coast. The coast of northern Cabo Delgado is very rich in fish, prawns, lobsters, polvo. I don't know how do you call polvo in English. But anyhow, these resources have been destroyed continuously, and the people who live on the coast, they are always considered to be fisher folk, and they are not. They are also agriculturalists. And I remember speaking to someone in a village, and he said, I'm happy because there is no, there will be no hunger because it's raining. So when it rains, we have good food in our farms, and we have good fishing in the sea. Today, they have these difficulties because they can't work in their farms. There is insurgency, and also they can't work in their use the sea because of the petrol companies, which have decided that some areas belong to them and not to the traditional owners of those areas. They are limited. And these companies probably, they are not so, how do you say, inexperienced. They should know what they say. They have been saying that they are going to give these people better boats, better technical. Please cut me when you think my time is off. So they have defined areas for them to fish, but that will not work because these fisher folk, these fishermen and women are not the social carriers for the technology they want to introduce. And then, as you know, we in Cabo Delgado, you have a fantastic ground where you can fish, which is called Banco de São Lázaro, the Bank of Saint Lazarus, if that can be said in English, where some years back you could go and, 500 years back, they called it the Bank of Saint Lazarus because of characteristics, but they arrived there without any food, and it was full of tuna and every type of fish. Now these resources have been overfished here and there. We don't have much information about quotas, etc., and also about quantities, but we should work with the Norwegian Institute of Fisheries and other institutions which have been following this. So just to make a painting with broad, how do you say? No, you don't say paintings, but using sorry?
Broad brush. A broad brush.
Yeah, with broad brush, we can say that the situation has to be monitored. There is a lot of work which has been done. Probably there is no much discussion about these issues. Yes, octopus, thank you. Celia Macamo, thank you. So we have to look at this. Then there's natural resources like the sea are also highways for other business. Even the land, you can use them to transport refugees, legal, illegal people who are going around, and you can also use the sea to go back and forth from the northern areas to the south, and you also can take something which gives much more money than any other activity, which is drugs. And we all know about this being a very important route from Afghanistan, Pakistan, etc., taking the end results of poppy cultivation to the consumer markets. And also the sea is a good place to have beaches, lodges, and so on, where people who have money come to drink tipo tinto and enjoy some white powder of different origins. So I try just to give you a general image of what is going on and of the complexity of the situation, and where we have to quite understand what is going on and say that there is a lot of data, there is people preoccupied in acting, etc., but I don't think the discussions are so open, and they should be more open, and the general public and the citizens of these areas should have access to the information, and their opinions should be put on the table, because they know much more than I do about the situation. And I have learned, basically being a historian who uses oral history as a method, I have really learned much more with them, and they are the best ecologists which I have ever worked with them. As my teacher and friend, Paul Dutton, who is 95 now, has been working with this. And about environment, yes, we have lost the elephants, we have lost rhinoceros in Cabo Delgado, we have lost this painted African dog, and then we can make a list of species which have been lost. And also, we have also to talk about the islands and the disaster. If we tell them, they will say, no, we're doing the best we can. Are the owners of the islands and who have been establishing themselves. A lot of them come from the landlords or wine lords. They come from Cape and South Africa up north. But then there are some Arab investors who have also set on these islands. So it is a difficult environment for us, and it is as a researcher, but it is also a difficult environment for the peasants and fisher folk to support themselves. I'm sorry. Thank you. That's the best I can do at this moment.
No, thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. And I think a few out of that description, I think does give us exactly what we need in terms of what you've spoken about. Number one, understanding the complexity of the issue, the importance of information and dialogue, views being shared, but also to appreciate that when we think about climate change impacts on ecosystems and crucially the ecosystem services on which communities rely, we must understand that this is happening in a context in which different power relations are being played out, power relations between communities and the state, between communities and the private sector, international capital, and I think have a much richer understanding of the dynamics that then play out in the social, economic, and ecological components of that. I want to hand over briefly to Celia. Yusuf, if you could mute yourself. And then Celia, to just give us very briefly some insights from your own research in a different area of Mozambique, in Beira.
Thanks, Alex. Thanks, Yusuf. I will actually start from something that Yusuf said about conflicts having impact on the way natural resources are used, that it can go also the other way around, the way that the resources are used can cause conflicts. Actually, in Cabo Delgado, and I will make a link with climate change, which is because of the political instability in Cabo Delgado, people from North Cabo Delgado fled to the south, towards the south, to Pemba, the capital, but also to other areas that were safe at the time, Ibu, the Quirimbas National Park, and all that area, which is a key biodiversity area, a very important national park also. And what happened at the time, of course, that represented more pressure over natural resources. But in 2019, there was a big cyclone Kenneth, that made landfall in the northern Cabo Delgado province. And what happened was that in some of the community-based conservation areas, the restrictions that were in place for the use of natural resources were eased. So there were areas where people were not allowed to fish, but because of the cyclone and the increase in the population, then those restrictions were eased. It was supposed to be for some time to help people recover from the cyclone. But the thing is, things never went back to what they used to be. The number of population, because of the refugees, the number of population increased, so the pressure over resources increased, and then some of these conservation areas were lost, particularly the community-based. I believe the impacts on the Quirimbas National Park are also, I'm not so sure, maybe Yusuf can help me on that, but that is a very clear example of how one thing can really influence the other. The other example that I wanted to bring is in Beira. Beira is the second most important city in Mozambique, high population density. It's a city below the average sea level, very vulnerable to climate change impacts. And in fact, in the last 3 years, the city has been impacted by 2 major cyclones and 1 very big storm, and lots of infrastructure, human lives, and livelihood sources of the communities were lost. Of course, there was some period of tension, but because I mean the impact was really devastating and people really needed a lot of aid. But on the other side, there was a lot of response from central government, from the municipality government, from international response aid also. So the way things unfolded were a little bit different. And actually to this date, there is still a lot going on resilient houses are being built. The municipality of Beira is now working on projects to increase coastal resilience. So hopefully, also because the issue of access to resources is not as big as Yusuf was explaining in Cabo Delgado, there are still alternatives, and because it is a urban area, the dependence over natural resources is a little bit smaller. Hopefully, things will not go the same way in Beira, and also Beira is more homogeneous in terms of political views. But yeah, if that's my perception of what's going on there. I think I'll leave it here. Thank you.
Excellent. Celia, thank you so much. As I said, I think it was fantastic to have Celia join us rather at the last moment, and I do apologize for that. But also just to have that contrast. I want to hand over now to Jürgen Schäffern for your remarks.
Good morning, and thank you for the opportunity to participate in this event. I was asked to give a short overview about the climate conflict nexus, which is complex because it is the interaction between two large systems. On the one hand, the climate system together with natural resources on the one hand, and human security and societal stability, so the social dimension on the other hand. And this is not a simple relationship, it's a two-way relationship, where you can say that climate risk interacts with conflict risk in a two-way. And this relationship can have positive and negative effects. Of course, climate risk can trigger conflict risk, but also possibly cooperation and on natural resources, for instance. And conflict risk can aggravate the climate change adaptation situation and resolution of the climate problem. And which one occurs more likely depends also on political factors like governance issues and the societal stability and societal dimensions. Over the last decade, there have been a number of studies, I think it amounts to more than 100, on an empirical relationship between climate and conflict, both quantitative studies as well as many qualitative studies increasingly in different regions of the world. Regarding the quantitative studies on a global scale, you can say that about half of them showed a significant link between climate and conflict. Some other studies found no significant link or ambiguous relationships, which is due to the complexity. You can say it depends on the societal conditions. So for that reason, the argument that climate change will lead to war is too simple. It can, of course, destabilize the society, and depending on its fragility. So the question whether climate is a conflict factor depends on socioeconomic conditions like population, like development level, like economic growth, and the depth of capacity, the level of democracy, the ethnic diversity, the political and government stability. So these are factors that determine whether climate has a conflict effect. The conflict itself is also complex. It ranges from war to protests, but also to cooperation and peace building on the positive side. And each of these factors can be affected by climate change. And there are so many possible pathways in which it can interact, like water can be affected by climate change and affect conflict, as well as land use and food, natural disasters, and migration also is a possible pathway. These issues are increasingly studied more in more detail, and the role of policies, institutions, and governance mechanisms. There was a comparative assessment that was published in Nature by Expert Assessment, where it showed the diversity of the opinions among the experts still for the past relationship between climate and conflict, which on average was about 5%, but ranged between 3 and 20%. among the different experts. For the future, the experts largely agree that climate change has effect on violent conflict in the future. And depending on whether you have a 2-degree scenario for the future, temperature rise, then it may be on average 13% increased probability, and for a 4-degree, maybe 26% on average of a substantial increase. But on the other hand, the study also showed that there's also a likelihood, depending on policy measures taken, the risk, the conflict risk of climate change can be also substantially reduced with a probability of maybe 25 or 30%. It depends on how the societies respond and their capacity to respond. The latest IPCC report, sixth assessment report, had also a lot of comparison of the existing studies, and they found there is an increasing risk of intrastate armed conflict onset and incidence, depending on the mediating factors like food, price, and water and land, and disasters, but also on the stability of the society and the civil institutions. And it also becomes clear that the political economic factors are more important actually to determine whether conflict emerges. In societies which are more stable, climate cannot destabilize easily, which in societies which already have a lot of conflict, there's increasing conflict risk. It is also possible that certain climate policies can aggravate the situation if they are not done in a conflict-sensitive way, which is called either maladaptation or mitigation. If it's done in the wrong way, can contribute to conflict. Geoengineering, for instance, can contribute to conflict. And so it's the question how the responses are done, okay, whether they increase conflict or reduce conflict. And this is an important issue for the future, that we should work more towards environmental peace building activities to reduce the conflict, and use environmental policy as a measure to reduce conflict. And this is very important at the micro level of societies, yeah? Bringing in the people and the participation of people into these policies. In particular, the role of women is very important in this context, and any other social groups that are suffering from the consequences that are involved in solving the problem. Otherwise, if conflict escalates and it moves to armed conflict itself can have negative effects on climate adaptation and further destabilize the situation. So there is a possibility of a downward slope. Climate change can aggravate conflict, and conflict can aggravate climate adaptation. So we should move away in a positive nexus between peace, development, and environmental protection. And this is the main challenge, to develop the synergies in all these fields. For instance, the possible positive synergies between food, water, and energy, which can be basically block the negative nexus. And this is the main challenge for the future. You can study this in many of the regional case studies, which are qualitative, and look at these details and try to find a way move away from the negative nexus of problems to the positive nexus of solutions. And African countries are particularly interesting in this regard, including North African countries, where we had this 10 years ago, the Arabic Spring, which initially started as a democratic movement, but had some destabilizing effect on governments as well as on conflict, as well as on migration patterns, which spread to the Mediterranean Sea, also to Europe, and contributed to instability there. So we should think more how in the future it can be moderated by adaptive governance, by climate diplomacy, by renewable energy projects, by resilience building, and by environmental peace building. I think this is the main challenge of the future, to overcome also the vicious cycles and move to virtuous cycles of the positive linkages. And there's a lot we can do in this field, and think about in a constructive way to mediate this relationship between climate and conflict towards sustainability and peace. So sustainable peace this is what we need to move to.
Thank you. Thank you. That was an excellent overview. I won't even attempt. I mean, there were such interesting concepts popping out there around, I think you mentioned environmental peace building or oriented around that. And I think really the key point is that when we think about climate vulnerability, to recognize that vulnerability or climate risk, shall we say, it has to do not only with the level of exposure to climate change, but crucially also those socioeconomic and developmental concerns, political concerns, and those are levers that can be focused on, that can be adjusted, can be changed. Without taking too much time, Julia, why don't you go ahead for us?
Hi, thank you, Alex, for having me, and thank you to my colleagues for this very insightful input. I would like to just add a few things with regard to the South African context, maybe, as that is my field of interest and field of research. So when it comes to the climate change impact in South Africa, I mean, the scientific community widely agrees, and the IPCC and the UNFCCC has pointed out that Southern Africa in general is considered a potential climate vulnerability hotspot. So temperatures are increasing faster than worldwide averages, and projections point to further increases ranging between, I think Jürgen also mentioned it, 2 degrees Celsius and 5 degrees Celsius by 2100. And temperature changes then impact, obviously, weather patterns, which in turn can interrupt food systems and exacerbate natural disasters, and compounding food insecurity and contributing to poor health and lost livelihoods. So low income levels within already politically, economically, and socially vulnerable states, such as Mozambique or South Africa, compound vulnerability even further. So accordingly, climate change is and will be a significant risk multiplier or amplifier, as we always say, for the region in general, and including South Africa and Mozambique, obviously, in the coming years. And already is, actually, as we can see in the recent events in South Africa, such as the floods that you mentioned, Alex, in the beginning in KZN or KwaZulu-Natal, or the current drought in Nelson Mandela Bay, for instance, which is facing day 0. I think I read a newspaper article at the end of May or by the end of May. And of course, the infamous drought in Cape Town, which lasted from 2015 to 2018, which shows that the effects of climate change are already here and they can be seen. So, and in terms of violence, when bringing those two phenomena together in South Africa, in terms of violence, at the same time, I would like to point out, so South Africa has obviously struggled with violence and issues such as gang violence or other forms of collective violence and protest violence. And violence does not always have to be war. Or what we immediately jump to, as you said, Alex, to guns and wars as we know them from the media, maybe, but collective violence can take on various forms. These can be wars, but also include other forms of collective violence, such as I said, protest violence, for example, or gang violence, or even xenophobic violence, which can also be seen in South Africa. So now attempting to bringing those two issues, very complex issues, as Jürgen said, together, many scholars actually predict, as well as the mainstream media, they predict an increase in violent conflict in African countries in times of drought, for instance, as a result of climate change. So whether that is also the case in South Africa is what I'm actually examining in my PhD dissertation. But there are already some signs that, that those two issues or problems do overlap. So when looking at the number of service delivery protests, for instance, in 2018, so during the peak of the Western drought, I remember clearly just before day 0 was announced, basically, or everyone was kind of like, we were approaching day 0 in Cape Town. Also in May, I think, May 2018, protests had increased to a number of 237 from 173 in the year before nationally, with the Eastern Cape and Western Cape leading those violent protests, or including violent protests. So at the same time, when looking at violent protests in South Africa, we probably all remember the violent protests in July in KZN, which may have been sparked obviously by the arrest of former President Jacob Zuma, but they were most likely the result of compounded issues as well. So as mentioned earlier, there are multiple risk factors for conflict and collective violence to occur. And just like the COVID-19 pandemic, climate risks or climate change can actually, or the climate crisis in general, can magnify and worsen those existing economic and political problems. So again, I would just like to point out that it takes multiple risk factors, just as Jürgen said, to come together for violent outbreaks to occur. So a climate event alone might not do that, but compounding existing issues can result in violent conflict. So it is also important to note that whoever bears the brunt of, climate change impacts, most likely, or actually also bears the brunt of conflict or conflict risk factors. And those marginalized communities need to be considered, if not, I think, put in the center to be protected when looking, as Jürgen also mentioned, looking at the way forward, looking at adaptation to climate change, or finding synergies. So that means when we talk about adaptation to climate change, we need to approach it in an integrated, conflict-sensitive manner in order to achieve those long-lasting effects or sustainable, peaceful environments, as you also mentioned, Alex. So if I can just quickly summarize the key points, basically, as my colleagues pointed out, and as I just said, I think the link between climate change and conflict is highly, or we all know it is highly complex and very contextual. So it really depends on the circumstances. And I think we always try to find a balance between oversimplifying the issue, or between not oversimplifying the issue rather, but simultaneously taking climate impact very seriously as a conflict factor, and as climate vulnerability risk factors, as well as conflict risk factors actually do overlap, they also tend to drive each other, which can be an opportunity. I mean, it can be seen as a negative, as Jürgen said, but it can also be seen as an opportunity to find a sustainable way, a long-lasting way to adapt to climate change. So thank you very much.
Excellent, excellent. Thank you so much. Thank you to all our panelists. Again, the opportunity is now for questions. Again, you can use either the chat or the Q&A function. There's a small number of questions that have come through. I'm gonna take the one by Richard Stephenson myself. Really, he simply asks, can we clarify in terms of the difference between seasonal natural disasters and natural disasters related to climate change? Are all natural disasters attributable to climate change? If not, how are the specific incidents differentiable? Now, obviously, natural disasters, droughts, floods, cyclones, these have all, been part of historical climate patterns. So to me, I don't think we need to dive too deeply into that question, because the discussion really isn't whether a particular incident is an example of climate change. Were the floods in Durban recently the result of climate change? Was Cyclone Idai an example of climate change? I think what's more important is to look at what the IPCC, what the global scientific community is telling us, which is that these sorts of natural disasters under a scenario where we're not able to curb carbon emissions are likely to become both more frequent and more severe. And then that means that the sort of responses that Jürgen and Julia in particular were talking about, adaptive governance, understanding the complexities and the interlinkages between these dimensions, And Yusuf and Celia has helped us understand what that looks like in a particular geographical setting. That becomes so crucial. So I wouldn't even suggest that we kind of get stuck in the weeds of whether a particular incident can be assigned as a climate change example of climate change. The point is that these are likely to become more frequent, and therefore our governance responses, even just conceptually our responses, need to start taking this more into account. Then there were two questions. The one just asking maybe in a little bit, if any more detail could be provided in terms of current or potential impact of climate change, specifically on the SADC mission in northern Mozambique. There's also a kind of a general question in terms of what is the status of the conflict right now. I do realize that the news isn't, it's hard to always get a very detailed assessment. It does seem to have been quieting down somewhat, but certainly it is not a conflict that has been resolved. So those, maybe Yusuf and Celia have something to say to that. Climate impact specifically on the SADC mission in Mozambique and the kind of situation of the Cabo Delgado conflict at the moment. And then there was a question about the political economy of the oil and gas sector in the East, particularly now thinking about offshore East Coast. This is something that both South Africa is promoting, Mozambique is promoting. I'm not sure exactly what angles maybe the person who posed the question can raise, because obviously there are many dimensions of the oil and gas sector and impacts potentially on conflict and climate. Let me hand briefly over to Yusuf and to Celia, if you have anything to say on those first two questions, specifically about the SADC mission in Mozambique and the situation right now in Cabo Delgado.
I can start. First of all, I would like to say that all over the region, we don't have positive peace. What we have is negative peace in the now and then, because what we have lulls in war and conflicts, but we don't have socio-economic conditions which save us from having conflicts or solving conflicts without picking up our six-shooters or whatever. They use AK-47s and other type of arms. So that is something which we have to have into consideration. About the impact of and the political economy of gas and oil, I think when I spoke about the situation in the coast in Cabo Delgado, I did say that people lost land, they lost forests, they lost access to the sea, and the projects which have been implemented are not the ones which the population wants. Even the local elites, they want to be partners of the international companies. They don't want to receive alms and handouts. So that is something which one has to look. And the fact that the population has been expelled from the zones of origin has created a lot of problems for natural resources. And one of the problems which you can see in any IDP camp you go to is the struggle for water. You have one or two sources, and the local ones want to, cut the access of those who came out from outside to that water source. The same thing with access to land. And the most serious thing which I had never seen was how anyone an IDP can't even cut a tree, which is that. And the person wants to use it to make charcoal, they can't, because they have to ask the owner of the land to cut the tree. in a country where the land belongs to the state. There is no private property of land. So you have a lot of this type of problems going on, and even the way the concessions have been given and the consultation with the local populations, etc., have been done in a way that it doesn't help people to state their positions. Going back to the war, look, the ecology of northern Cabo Delgado is very interesting because you have a big difference in the land. It goes from 0 meters to 600, 800 meters. Then you go down in the valleys and creeks and so on, and you have a lot of fossil rivers flowing from Nangad down to the coast in Musimbo, etc. And the insurgents, they practice a guerrilla war. So they are sitting in the middle of these places where there is water, where they find place to stay, and the regular armies are always sitting in high areas and near towns, and where if they go out, they go 5 kilometers from each side of the road. They don't go down where the guerrilla fighters, the insurgents, they sit. So I don't think this war is going to end so soon. And I also think that there has to be, and there is, internal causes for having this war. Means that a lot of this population has been disinvested. They don't have, they can come and vote, but their vote doesn't count much. And there are other problems. There are ethnic problems. There are different things. And the locals and the Mwani speakers in all over the coast, they, in the interviews I had with them, they would tell me that, look, this is basically an attempt to send us out of our area and send us, and a young researcher with whom I spoke in the field told me, it reminds me of Yugoslavia, where we had a cleanup of certain ethnicities, etc., out of the map and a creation of different states. So it could be something which can happen in the future. I hope it shouldn't. It will not. We'll fight against it, but it's something which we have to take into consideration. These petrol companies and so on, we don't know what they're going to do. Now they say they're waiting, then they're going to invest, but there will not be a percolation of money and wealth, etc., to the local population. We have Band-Aid for people who are living in the area. So I think that we have to change our approach to development, and peace is something which has to be included into it, because if there is not,
Yusuf, I'm going to have to cut you short there a little bit because I just want to give our other panelists a minute for final remarks. Celia, anything from you?
I think my final word would be around the fact that yes, climate change is posing very big pressure over communities, particularly where the dependence on natural resources is really very high, and where the level of exploitation is already either uncontrolled, unsustainable, or unsustainable. So that's additional pressure. But if the previous conditions are like the case of Beira, where we see that yes, the communities are in a very complicated situation, but it's kind of a scenario where you can see people preparing, they have room, they have space to adapt. They are working on coastal resilience. They are doing a lot of mangrove restoration. They are doing a lot of other ecosystems rehabilitation, and hopefully that will increase the room, the chances that they have to reduce the impacts of climate change. In other places, the situation is much more complicated. When the access to resources is much more limited, then the chances of the conflict to escalate are much more. And unfortunately, there are several areas where we have the second case, where resources such as water or even wood, land can also be a very, very, very big issue in a place like Beta, where it's essentially a wetland. If the sea level is rising, people don't have access to land. People are literally losing their houses. So then is where we have the more complicated scenarios. And the response is case by case. I don't think there is one size that will fit all, and we need to prepare for that. We need to try to start looking at what can be done in every particular areas. Yeah, thanks. I think that would be my last words.
Thank you. That was fantastic, Celia. Julia, I see your hand is up.
Yeah, I just wanted to say, as Celia and Yusuf said so nicely, it just really shows that the question is, when it comes to natural resources and scarcity, that it is a question of who has access to and power of those, the accessibility obviously is always a power question as well. And as you mentioned as well, I think, Alex, in the beginning, power imbalances combined with natural resource scarcity is obviously, crucial.
Absolutely. I see there's a comment, I don't see the name, but in the chat asking, is the common denominator in all these vulnerable areas of Southern Africa and other areas of the world that human populations are experiencing unsustainable and uncontrolled growth? Yes, in short, no. Yes. Okay, well, I mean, what we've heard is unsustainable growth, uncontrolled growth, absolutely, in terms of undermining the natural capital, resources, the ecosystem services on which communities depend. But I think a key message as well that's come out is that it's not just the growth dimension or the lack of growth, but it's the governance dimension as well. And that's, again, speaks to how power is exercised and managed, and how voice and participation is brought into governance processes. And that's where this concept that Jürgen mentioned of adaptive governance becomes so crucial. We're in the final minute, so Jürgen, Julia, it's going to be final words from you, and then I'll wrap. Jürgen first, and then over to Julia.
Yeah, the question is which growth, of course, can be unsustainable growth, which is at the cost of the environment, exploiting the environment, but also exploiting the people. Growth should be done in the interest of both the environment and the people. And there should be some principles applied. And as far as I see it, the fossil age that we are still in had been very destructive, and it's always been associated with violent conflict. And as far as I know, in this region, Cabo Delgado, there's fossil fuels, particularly natural gas, is one of the drivers of the conflict, and also drivers of terrorism and drivers of violence, as it has been in many other parts of the world. It's not only in African countries. You see your fossil wars also in the Middle East, in Asia, in Europe, and now also in other countries of the world. So I think the fossil age has been very violent over the last hundreds of years, and it's still very violent. And I think we should move away from this towards more peaceful and sustainable energy sources, which are often renewable energy sources. And that should be done in a way that is acceptable in the interest of the people, and not only of the privileged people, but of the whole society. Then growth can be sustained. And this is the main challenge. It's not population density as such, which is harmful, but the way people behave towards the environment, or whether they integrate themselves into the environment and benefit from the natural reproduction processes that are existing in the environment. And I think we should have a balance of people in nature. I think that is the main challenge.
Very well put. Very well put. Julia, did you want a final word?
Yeah, basically what Jürgen said so correctly and well. I just wanted to also point out, if I understand the question correctly, this refers to human population growth. So when it comes to, as Jürgen said, economic growth, like that can be done sustainably, and human population can grow sustainably as well. It's just about how it happens. So what kind of growth it is and how it is happening. So I think human, or just an increase in population alone, does not worsen the situation. So I think that is actually quite an outdated theory. So a lot has to come together. And when it comes to growth is possible and prosperity is possible. It just needs to be done in a sustainable way. So just to add.
Absolutely. I think that is certainly a point worth making, that if and I see now, maybe I didn't emphasize that, but yeah, if the question was primarily whether it was human population growth, which is fundamentally underlying all the problems, then I would also disagree. We have many areas where we have high populations, but where the governance systems, the systems of economic contribution, the systems that manage and sustain and sustainably manage natural resource systems that underline that growth allow for stable and peaceful and prosperous societies. Well, we've reached the end of our hour. It's been a very stimulating and thought-provoking discussion. Once again, thank you very much to our panelists who've taken the time. Thank you to our attendees who have stuck with us right to the end. We really do appreciate you participating. I would definitely encourage you to please do evaluate the webinar. Sarasa, you'd need to now help me quickly on this, because I see you've provided the link in the chat, but I understand that the participants are not able to view the chat.
No,
so
they can all view the chat. They
can view the chat.
Yes, yes.
Okay, very good. So there's a link available there. We really do appreciate your feedback. And as I said when I started this event, we really do try and engage, promote dialogue as much as possible, promote evidence-based policy making, and that's why you'll see there's a wealth of information, including a piece that Julia recently wrote for us, which is available for free download off the website. Now that I realize you are all here, let me just in the chat put that link to our website. And with that, I will close the event. Thank you again.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.